What if everything you thought you knew about justice, power, and even democracy itself is about to fundamentally change, and you're only just now catching up? You guys, I need you to lean in on this, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just another political squabble. It's not just another headline that fades by next week. This is a powder keg. And the fuse? It was lit weeks ago, in a dusty, forgotten corner of America, with the death of a young woman named Renee Good. Her name might not be trending on your feeds right now, but trust me, her story is the earthquake sending shockwaves through Washington, D.C. right this second. Right now, as you're watching this, the halls of Congress are not just buzzing, they're igniting. They're debating something so explosive, so fundamentally challenging to the very fabric of our government, that most people are completely oblivious to the scale of the impending fallout. We're talking about direct, unprecedented consequences being demanded for none other than ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and for a Governor Kristi Noem, whose defiance has become a lightning rod. And just when you thought it couldn't get crazier, a titan of American politics, a figure who still casts a shadow longer than any other, Donald J. Trump, stepped into the fray. He didn't just comment. He didn't just tweet. He delivered an ultimatum. A no-holds-barred, take-it-or-leave-it decree that has paralyzed one side of the aisle and emboldened the other. An ultimatum that has ripped the mask off the polite debates and exposed the raw, brutal power struggle for the soul of this nation. You see, it started with Renee Good's killing, a tragedy that spiraled into accusations of excessive force, systemic failures, and a cover-up. It escalated when lawmakers, fed up and furious, demanded a full-blown investigation, not just into a single incident, but into the entire operational framework of a federal agency. They're not just asking for policy changes. They're talking about dismantling parts of the system, fundamentally altering how law enforcement operates in this country. And Governor Noem? She's standing her ground, a defiant symbol in a battle that's quickly becoming a clash of ideologies. But Trump's ultimatum? That's the real kicker. It's the invisible hand, pulling strings, shifting tectonic plates beneath the surface. It's the reason why the most powerful people in America are now walking on eggshells, why every word is weighed, and every decision is scrutinized. Because what he said, what he demanded, has set in motion a chain of events that could dismantle careers, reshape political parties, and fundamentally alter the power dynamics in Washington and beyond. This isn't just a story about a killing. This is about power, accountability, and the terrifying realization that the institutions we rely on are far more fragile than we ever imagined. And the consequences of Trump's ultimatum? They're not just for a few politicians or an agency. They're for us. All of us. And most people? They have no idea what's truly about to happen. So buckle up. Because we're about to dive deep into the belly of the beast, where the truth is stranger and far more dangerous than any fiction. The spark that ignited the powder keg. But who was Renee Good, really? And why is her death, this one tragic event, tearing Washington, D.C. apart right now, revealing cracks in our system we never even knew existed? To understand the seismic shifts rumbling through Washington, we have to go back to the beginning, to the quiet, devastating origin point. We need to talk about Renee Good. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't a lobbyist. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend. A vibrant soul navigating the complexities of life, just like millions of other Americans. Her story began not in the marble halls of power, but in a small community. A place where the daily struggles are far removed from the geopolitical machinations of the capital. Renee Good was, by all accounts, a person trying to make her way, trying to build a better life for herself and her family. She was part of a vulnerable population, a community often overlooked, often marginalized, and tragically, often unprotected. Her background, her heritage, her very existence, placed her in the crosshairs of a system that, for many, feels less like a shield and more like a sword. The details of her death are, even now, shrouded in conflicting narratives, a fog of official statements and anguished accusations. What we know for sure is that she encountered agents from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. The circumstances leading to that encounter are themselves a point of fierce contention. Was it a routine operation? An intelligence-driven raid? Or something far more ambiguous, a misstep that escalated tragically out of control? The official reports, as they stand, paint one picture. But the accounts from community members, from witnesses, from Renee's own family, paint a very different, far more disturbing portrait. They speak of confusion, of fear, of a sudden, violent confrontation that no one anticipated. They describe a scene where questions outnumbered answers, where official protocol seemed to dissolve into chaos. And then, the unthinkable happened. Renee Good was shot. Killed. In an instant, a life was extinguished, and a family was shattered. The immediate aftermath was a maelstrom. Local law enforcement, caught in the middle, struggled to piece together what had transpired. ICE, as an agency, initially offered a boilerplate statement, a carefully worded response designed to control the narrative. But in the age of instant information, in the era of citizen journalism and social media amplification, containment is a pipe dream. The story, fueled by raw grief and boiling anger, spread like wildfire. The local community reacted with an outpouring of grief, but also with a potent, undeniable rage. Protests erupted. Vigils were held. The name Renee Good became a rallying cry, a symbol of perceived injustice. People took to the streets, not just to mourn, but to demand answers. They wanted to know how this could happen. They wanted to know why it happened. And critically, they wanted to know who would be held accountable. The emotional resonance of the situation was immense. This wasn't just a distant tragedy. It was a visceral, personal wound for countless individuals who saw themselves, their families, their neighbors, in Renee's story. It was a stark reminder of the power dynamics at play between federal agencies and local communities, especially those communities that often feel voiceless. But then, the story took a sharp, almost theatrical turn. Enter Governor Noem. Known for her unyielding conservative stances and her fierce defense of what she perceives as law and order, Noem didn't hesitate. Almost immediately, she inserted herself into the narrative, not as a conciliator, but as a staunch defender of the actions taken. Her statements were unequivocal. She condemned what she called anti-law enforcement rhetoric, stood firm behind the ICE agents involved, and dismissed calls for broad investigations as politically motivated attacks. Her messaging was clear. This was a regrettable incident, perhaps, but one that occurred in the line of duty, under challenging circumstances. She painted a picture of brave officers confronting a difficult situation, and she drew a line in the sand, daring anyone to cross it. This wasn't just a simple political stance. Noem's swift, unwavering defense wasn't just about protecting ICE. It was about positioning herself and her state as bastions against what she and her allies often frame as an encroaching federal overreach and a progressive agenda run wild. She leveraged the incident, transforming it from a local tragedy into a national battleground over the very principles of governance, immigration enforcement, and the role of the state versus the federal government. Her words weren't just spoken, they were broadcast, amplified, and absorbed by a national audience, polarizing opinions and hardening positions on both sides. And that, my friends, is where the first ripple effect reached Washington, D.C. Noem's aggressive defense, far from calming the waters, actually poured gasoline on the fire. Her dismissal of accountability concerns, her unwavering support for ICE in the face of such a tragic outcome, served to infuriate a significant bloc of lawmakers. They saw her actions not as leadership, but as an obstruction of justice, a blatant disregard for human life, and a political maneuver designed to appeal to a specific base, irrespective of the facts. This wasn't an isolated incident that could be swept under the rug. Renee Good's death, exacerbated by Governor Noem's controversial stance, quickly became a flashpoint, a litmus test for a deeply divided Congress. Lawmakers, particularly those from progressive districts and those representing minority communities, felt an intense pressure to act. They saw in Renee Good's story not just an individual tragedy, but a symptom of a larger, systemic problem within federal agencies like ICE. They viewed it as emblematic of a culture of impunity, a lack of oversight, and a desperate need for reform. The calls began to grow louder, echoing through the halls of the Capitol. It started with demands for transparency, for unredacted reports, for witness testimonies. Then it escalated. Specific members of Congress, emboldened by public outrage and fueled by their own convictions, began to push for a full-scale, independent investigation. They wanted answers, not just about the specific incident involving Renee Good, but about the broader operational procedures, the training protocols, the use of force policies, and the accountability mechanisms, or lack thereof, within ICE. This wasn't just about one agent or one local office. This was about an entire federal apparatus, its power, its reach, and its impact on the lives of ordinary people. The questions being raised were existential. Is ICE operating within its mandated authority? Are its agents adequately trained? Are there sufficient checks and balances to prevent abuses? These were not new questions, but Renee Good's death, coupled with Governor Noem's provocative defense, gave them an undeniable urgency. It propelled them from academic debates to the forefront of the national political agenda. The initial demands were clear: an immediate, impartial investigation into Renee Good's shooting, led by an independent body, not by ICE itself. But it didn't stop there. Lawmakers started to connect the dots, linking this incident to a pattern of alleged misconduct, of disproportionate targeting, of a lack of transparency that many argue has plagued the agency for years. They called for a reevaluation of current immigration enforcement laws, questioning their effectiveness, their fairness, and their human cost. They wanted policy changes, not just minor tweaks, but fundamental reforms that would redefine the mission and methods of ICE. And then, the stakes really ratcheted up. Beyond policy changes, beyond investigations, some lawmakers began to whisper, then openly demand, accountability not just for the agents involved, but for the leadership of ICE itself. They talked about congressional oversight hearings with subpoena power. They talked about potential legal repercussions, not just for individuals, but for the agency as a whole. And they began to discuss what was once almost unthinkable: structural changes, including potential defunding, reorganization, or even a complete overhaul of the agency. This wasn't just political posturing. This was a serious challenge to the very existence and operational integrity of a major federal law enforcement body. So, in the span of just a few weeks, a single, tragic death transformed into a national crisis. Renee Good's name became synonymous with a larger struggle, a battle over power, justice, and accountability. Her story, ignited by local grief and amplified by a defiant governor, sent tremors directly into the heart of Washington, D.C., forcing a deeply divided Congress to confront uncomfortable truths about federal power, state sovereignty, and the very meaning of justice in America. It laid bare the deep-seated tensions that have been simmering for years, and now, fueled by outrage and political ambition, they threatened to boil over. This wasn't just a debate, it was a looming political earthquake, and the ground was just starting to tremble. The political earthquake, Washington's battle lines. What exactly are these lawmakers demanding, And why are these specific actions so utterly unprecedented, threatening to reshape American law enforcement as we know it, pulling back the curtain on a struggle for power rarely seen in public view? Alright, so the spark is lit. Renee Good's death, Governor Noem's defiant stance, it all created a volatile cocktail. Now, let's talk about what happened when that cocktail hit the marble floors of Washington, D.C. This wasn't just a debate, folks. This was a full-blown political earthquake, shaking the foundations of established power structures and exposing the raw, brutal battle lines in Congress. What transpired next was nothing short of a political cage match, with unprecedented demands on the table. The initial rumblings quickly grew into a roar. Progressive lawmakers, many of whom have long advocated for reforms within federal law enforcement, seized the moment. They saw Renee Good's death not as an anomaly, but as damning evidence of systemic issues within ICE. They rallied, not just around the immediate call for justice for Renee, but around a broader agenda of accountability and oversight. These weren't just generic calls for reform. These were specific, pointed demands that, if met, would fundamentally alter the landscape of federal immigration enforcement. First, the immediate demand, a full, independent investigation. Not just an internal review by ICE, which many argue would be inherently biased, but an investigation led by an outside entity, perhaps the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, or even a special congressional committee with subpoena power. They wanted unvarnished facts, unredacted reports, and sworn testimony from every agent, every supervisor, and every official involved. The goal wasn't just to find out what happened, but who was responsible, and crucially, why the standard protocols, if they existed, apparently failed so spectacularly. This demand alone was a direct challenge to the traditional autonomy of federal agencies, a message that they would no longer be allowed to police themselves. But that was just the beginning. The calls quickly escalated to a much more radical proposition, a reevaluation, and potentially a significant reduction in ICE's funding and operational scope. You heard that right. Not just cutting a few programs, but talking about defunding or even restructuring a major federal agency. This wasn't a casual suggestion. This was a war cry from a segment of Congress arguing that ICE, as currently constituted, is beyond reform and operates with a level of impunity that is unacceptable in a democratic society. They argued that its broad mandate, often conflated with border protection, actually leads to overreach into communities, tearing families apart and perpetuating cycles of fear and distrust. The idea was to strip away some of its enforcement powers, perhaps reassigning certain functions to other agencies, or drastically limiting its domestic operational footprint. This is a monumental ask, a direct assault on a federal agency that has been a linchpin of immigration enforcement for decades. And then there's Governor Noem. Her unwavering defense of ICE, her outright dismissal of accountability concerns, only fueled the fire. Lawmakers, particularly those who viewed her stance as an obstruction of justice, began to demand accountability not just for ICE, but for her. The calls included ethics probes into her administration's handling of the aftermath, allegations of interfering with potential investigations, and even veiled threats of legal challenges to state policies that might be seen as enabling or protecting federal agents from scrutiny. Some even discussed using congressional power to compel her testimony or to investigate potential federal funding implications for her state if she continued to obstruct justice or deny accountability. This is where the state versus federal conflict really hit the fan, a direct challenge to a sitting governor's authority and judgment. It wasn't just about her opinions. It was about her actions, and whether those actions crossed a line into potentially illegal or unethical behavior. The policy changes being debated were not minor tweaks. They ranged from sweeping reforms to use of force doctrines for all federal law enforcement, mandating stricter de-escalation training and accountability for non-lethal and lethal force, to fundamental alterations in immigration law itself. Lawmakers were pushing for amendments that would limit ICE's ability to conduct interior enforcement operations without local consent, or to detain individuals without specific, immediate threats. They debated ending certain programs that allow local law enforcement to deputize federal immigration agents, arguing that these programs blur the lines of authority and lead to abuses. It was a comprehensive assault on the existing framework, driven by the conviction that the current system is broken and inherently unjust. The debates themselves were brutal. Imagine the scene: firebrands from the progressive wing, their voices echoing with righteous indignation, citing Renee Good's name as proof of systemic oppression, demanding immediate and radical change. They painted ICE as an out-of-control agency, a rogue entity operating without sufficient checks and balances, often targeting vulnerable communities. Their arguments were often emotional, drawing on personal testimonies and the broader narrative of historical injustices. They spoke of the moral imperative to act, to dismantle structures that they believed perpetuated harm. On the other side, conservative defenders, often aligned with Governor Noem's ideology, pushed back with equal force. They portrayed ICE as a critical bulwark against illegal immigration, a necessary component of national security. They defended the agents as brave men and women doing a difficult job in dangerous circumstances, often vilified by political opportunists. They argued that defunding or dismantling ICE would create chaos at the borders, embolden criminal enterprises, and undermine the rule of law. They accused their opponents of playing politics with national security, of exploiting a tragic incident for partisan gain, and of actively seeking to weaken the nation's ability to enforce its own laws. For them, Governor Noem was a hero, a courageous leader standing up for common sense and defending those who protect the country. Moderates, caught in the crossfire, found themselves in an impossible position. They acknowledged the tragedy of Renee Good's death and the need for accountability, but they also recognized the political and practical implications of drastically overhauling a federal agency. They sought compromise, looking for pathways to reform without completely dismantling existing structures. But in this highly charged environment, compromise often felt like capitulation. And finding common ground proved to be an almost impossible task. The political center, already strained, threatened to crack under the immense pressure. The battle lines were drawn not just along party lines, but within parties themselves. There were conservative voices who, while generally supportive of law enforcement, expressed concerns about the specific circumstances of Renee Good's death and the potential for a bad apple scenario, urging for transparent investigations. And there were more centrist Democrats who, while pushing for reform, were wary of calls to abolish ICE, understanding the political repercussions of such a radical stance in swing districts. The internal fault lines were as significant as the external ones. The sheer audacity of these demands, defunding a federal agency, challenging a sitting governor's actions, overhauling fundamental policy, made these debates utterly unprecedented. This wasn't about tweaking a budget line item or passing a minor piece of legislation. This was about reshaping the very architecture of American governance and law enforcement. The outcome of these debates would not just impact ICE or Governor Noem. It would set profound precedents. Imagine the implications. If Congress can successfully demand such radical changes for one federal agency, what does that mean for others? If a governor can be subjected to congressional ethics probes for their stance on a federal incident, what does that mean for states' rights and executive authority? This wasn't just about the here and now. It was about the future of federal power, the delicate balance between state and national interests, and the definition of justice itself. The intensity, the vitriol, the sheer stakes involved, It all transformed the situation from a tragedy into a constitutional crisis in the making. Every politician knew it, every pundit observed it, and every American, whether they realized it or not, stood to be affected by the outcome of this extraordinary political earthquake. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the tension was palpable. But then, as if the political temperature wasn't already boiling, an entirely new, and far more powerful, force entered the arena. A force that would not only reshape the battle lines, but would utterly dominate the entire narrative. A force that commanded allegiance from millions, and fear from many more. This was the moment when the entire game changed. The elephant in the room, Trump's unseen hand. But as Washington burned, caught in a political firestorm of its own making, an even more explosive fuse was lit. Because amidst the chaos, Donald Trump, in his own inimitable way, delivered an ultimatum. But what was it, and to whom? And why is it the real reason everyone in power, from Capitol Hill to the White House, is walking on eggshells right now, fearing the true consequences of challenging the most powerful voice in American politics? All right, deep breath, folks. Because if you thought the congressional brawl was intense, you haven't seen anything yet. While the Capitol was tearing itself apart over Renee Good's death, over ICE, and over Governor Noem, there was a looming presence, a political force that still commands an almost cult-like following. A force that, when it chooses to act, can instantly shift the entire gravitational pull of American politics. I'm talking, of course, about Donald J. Trump. For weeks, as the Renee Good story escalated, as the calls for ICE's accountability grew louder, as Governor Noem dug in her heels, Trump remained relatively quiet. A few cryptic social media posts here and there, perhaps a veiled comment at a rally, but nothing direct, nothing that truly put his immense weight behind either side. Many wondered if he would stay out of it, perhaps viewing it as a messy domestic issue that didn't directly serve his larger political ambitions. But anyone who understands Donald Trump knows better. He thrives in chaos. He senses opportunity. And when the stakes get high enough, when the narrative becomes sufficiently polarized, he always enters the arena, not as a spectator, but as the main event. And enter he did. But it wasn't just a tweet. It wasn't just a rally speech where he casually mentioned the issue. What he delivered was something far more potent, far more strategic, and far more terrifying for those who stood in his path. He delivered an ultimatum. A non-negotiable demand that instantly changed the calculations for every single politician in Washington, D.C., and beyond. This wasn't a suggestion. This was a decree. So what was this ultimatum? And to whom was it delivered? Here's the kicker, folks, and this is where most people have absolutely no idea about the true nature of the storm that's brewing. Trump's ultimatum wasn't directed at ICE. It wasn't directly at Governor Noem, though it certainly benefited her. No. Donald Trump delivered his ultimatum directly to the United States Congress. Specifically, he issued a blistering statement, initially via his social media platform, then amplified by his extensive media network and loyal surrogates, directly targeting the lawmakers who were pushing for investigations, defunding, and structural changes to ICE. His message was stark, unequivocal, and delivered with the full, unvarnished force of his political power. He declared, in no uncertain terms, that any Republican who voted to investigate, defund, or otherwise undermine ICE in the wake of the Renee Good incident would be considered an enemy of the America First movement. He went further, stating that he would actively campaign against them, endorse their primary opponents, and use his colossal influence to ensure their political careers were effectively terminated. But it didn't stop there. He didn't just target Republicans. He issued a chilling warning to any lawmaker,